The Neanderthal man lived 700,000 to 35,000 years ago during the Middle Paleolithic nomadic life. In 2010, we had the first rough version of the entire genome of the Neanderthal and saw this pattern that showed that Neanderthal had mixed with the ancestors. Neanderthal and Denisovan genes are found in all living non-Africa populations back in Asia, due to Homo sapiens in that region interbreeding with the two species. Denisovans 18-foot human giants who lived 700,000–40,000 years back in Asia. Denisovans. The species has been classified as Homo sapiens SSP, Denisova and Homo sp. Altai SSP is subspecies and SP is subspecies. An unusual size, as much as 3 times a modern 6 feet tall man, every last one of these species. Here is a comparison of the average Homo sapien teeth versus that of the Denisovan tooth. This is a Homo naledi, a very small, primitive species from 236,000 years ago. She is what you call a Homo floresiensis, a dwarf species of human living, who lived in Flores until about 50,000 years ago. This little guy is a Homo luzonensis, another dwarf species, living in Luzon until roughly 50,000 years ago. The Homo erectus, a likely ancestor, with a smaller brain. Caves found in Southeast Asia until about 100,000 years ago. The Grimaldi man. Grimaldi man is the first early modern human in Africa who migrated to Europe and the rest of the world after the evolution of modern man on the African plains. From the African plains to colonizing Europe. According to Dr. Stephen Oppenheimer, a geneticist at Oxford College, it's clear that based on DNA evidence, modern Europeans all originate from Grimaldi man, who was the first early modern human in Africa before humans spread across the world. Evidence of Grimaldi man's life during the Stone Age on the African plains has been found in archaeological remains such as skull and bone fragments, stone tools and rock art. In Africa, Grimaldi man had already developed artistic expression as evident in the rock paintings, which also served a kind of historical record of the life and culture of the life of early Grimaldi man on the African plains. However, between 70,000 and 100,000 years ago, the first early modern humans in Africa began moving from the African continent into Europe and Asia, and eventually, Grimaldi man would reach as far as Australia. Migration to Europe. Sometime about 45,000 BC. The great glacial ice sheets that covered most of Europe started to melt, and a group, or groups of these Khoisan peoples walked across the Gibraltar Straits and entered once in Europe. Grimaldi man continued his migrations, and came to eventually inhabit all of Europe and northern Asia. The easternmost limit of his range appears to have been the settlement known as Malta in Siberia, Russia, just north of Mongolia. Here is a scientific reconstruction of the skull called mitochondrial Eve. This alludes to the biblical Eve, which has led to repeated misrepresentations or misconceptions in journalistic accounts on the topic. According to this analysis, the mtDNA of all modern humans can be traced back to a woman who lived in Africa sometime between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. This woman has been nicknamed Eve by scientists. This theory is supported by genetic evidence that shows that all contemporary humans share a common mtDNA ancestor. Vanessa Hayes, a geneticist at the Garvan Institute of Medical Research and the University of Sydney in Australia, is leading research that aims to pinpoint exactly where these Homo sapiens originated in Africa. It is believed that Homo sapiens evolved from Africa over 200,000 years ago based on genetic and fossil evidence. Eve macro haplogroup L is the most basal of human mtDNA haplogroups, from which all other haplogroups descend, specifically, from haplogroup L3L0. It is found mostly in Africa. DNA is inherited 50% from your mother and 50% from your father, but mitochondrial DNA is inherited from your mother only and can remain unchanged for thousands of years. mtDNA is generally passed on mixed from mothers to children of both sexes, along the maternal line, or matrilineally. Matrilineal descent goes back to our mothers, to their mothers, until all female lineages converge. The male analog to the mitochondrial Eve is the Y-chromosomal Adam, or YMRCA, the individual from whom all living humans are patrilineally descended. As the identity of both matrilineal and patrilineal MRCAs is dependent on genealogical history pedigree collapse, they need not have lived at the same time. The ancient astronauts known as the Anunnaki ruled Earth for over 12 shars, with one shar equaling up to 36,000 years times that by 12 for a total of 432,000 years occupying this planet called Earth. Based of the Sumerian king list, of the Enuma Elish cuneiform tablets which was dated about 2100 BC, says, after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. They established many societies in ancient Mesopotamia. Sumer was the earliest, rising in about 6000 BCE. Sumer consisted of many separate city-states across the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. By 2300 BCE, the city of Akkad dominated Sumer. Over 200 astronaut deities originally came to this planet to abstract Earth's enriched gold, in which they needed for climatic factors of survival within their distant planet of Nibiru, Sirius B, which is a small planet that oscillates around Sirius A. The more minor deities that came to Earth watched over streams, hills, and forests. Eridu is considered a being the oldest city in Mesopotamia, that was also the home of the oldest and largest ziggurat in Mesopotamia. This was the temple of one of the most important gods of the ancient Near East. He was known as Enki to the Sumerians and Ea to the later Akkadians and Babylonians. The importance of a deity was tied to the fortunes of its city. Just as Eridu was the home of Enki, his half-brother Enlil was chief deity at Nippur, and sister Inanna or Ishtar was supreme at Uruk, the sun god Utu was the patron deity of Sapar, and so on. Along with Anan or Anu the sky god and Enlil, the god of the air, Enki was one of the three most important gods in Sumer. He arrived very early in Sumer from Dilmun, probably the island of Bahrain in the Persian Gulf. In fact, the Sumerians believed Enki personally created Eridu, elevating it from the marshy ground on what was then the shore of the Gulf. What's interesting is that Enki was the god of the sweet waters needed for life. He was depicted with two streams of water flowing from his shoulders that represented the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the main sources of fresh water in Mesopotamia. Enki was the god of magic, craftsmanship, and wisdom. Although Enlil was the king of the gods, Enki was the keeper of the Mies of the minor gods also known as the Ajijis. They were the workers who formed the fundamental concepts and gifts of civilization, everything from religious practices to social interaction to music. The Ajijis' originally name was spelt IGI4GI4. The Anunnaki based themselves and their authority by numerical ideograms, and Enki's was 40, a sacred number and vibrational soundwave. Just so you know, I will cover this topic in a later video for a more in-depth understanding of their origins and how it all ties in with our very own genetic coding that can help us unlock our infinite potential. Now back to the story. Ninhursag was the wife of Enki and co-scientist. After so many failed attempts to create workers for the gods, she decided it would be best to carry the creation herself through manual in vitro, using three fundamental elements. 1. Using small macros of her macro haplogroup DNA sequence that she spliced and degraded. 2. The Bacillus subtilis DNA extraction protocols, from the Homo erectus species. And 3. Extracted bacteria cells from the marshy garden filled with self-producing lotus plants and other succulent species of natural elements. Enki was fascinated with underwater life forms. As he studied aquatics for decades, he made fish suits for himself and had developed the ability to breathe underwater for 40 days without coming up for one single breath. Ninhursag, their chief medical science officer, believed this was the ultimate solution to their worker replacement problem. The Ubaids were the first group of people to settle in southern Mesopotamia. They inhabited this area earlier than 5300 BC. The Ubaids settled in villages. They lived in large houses made of clay with many rooms, which were big enough to house extended families. Ubaid houses were characterized by a distinctive plan. The main part of the house consisted of a central cruciform area with an entrance hall, staircase and living rooms on either side. During this time period, from about 5000 to 4000 BCE, mysteriously people began to settle in villages and create cities. The Ubaids began to develop farming techniques and domesticated animals for agricultural use. Ubaid grave sites indicate there may have been a social hierarchy developing over 1000-year time period. An exclusive class of chieftains were the administrators of the temples, and presided over legal matters. These small figurines that were found are shaped and then baked to harden the clay. The figurines were usually females, breastfeeding a young child and were adorned with colored ornaments. The heads and eyes sometimes resembled lizards, and a reptilian-formed shape used for these figurines. According to the Terra Netter tile discovery made underneath the early Egyptian dynastic temple at Abydos, the Anu people were the first settlers of the Nile Valley who founded Kush and Kemet after developing the Tossetti Nile Valley culture when they first started the Neolithic Revolution in Africa circa 3400 BCE and recognized as the world's oldest civilization. The translation of the glazed carving depicting the Anu as the first people of Egypt describes the black Anu man as the high priest Terra Netter of the temples of the god Seth of the cities of the Anu peoples. The Terra Netter tile has been used as evidence to demonstrate that the Anu were the first settlers of the Nile Valley in Egypt or Kemet that developed a high Kemetic civilization which may have been the result of a developmental cycle going back as far as 10,000 BC which was then inherited by Egypt's first dynasty under Narmer. According to the Anu artifacts, the origin of civilization in Egypt can be found in the first African settlers of the Nile Valley in Egypt, specifically the Ethiopian Anu. It is from the Anu of Egypt's pre-dynastic period that the Egyptians get most of their laws and culture including learning to honor kings and gods, how to bury them, sculpture and writing all of which were invented by the Ethiopian Anu who first inhabited Egypt when they first settled the Nile Valley. The Anu as the first inhabitants of the Nile Valley that created Egypt were agricultural people who raised cattle on a large scale along the Nile Valley. Most ancient Egyptian funerary texts such as the Book of the Dead and pyramid texts can also be attributed to the Anu culture in the dynastic period beginning with the Old Kingdom. According to historians like Cheikh Anta Diop and Abi Emile Amelino, carved ivory objects such as the Terra Netter tile found at the tombs at Abydos, especially the tomb of Osiris, it reveals in their origin that the first settlers of the prehistoric or pre-dynastic Nile Valley Egypt were the Anu Black Afrikans. The claims that Anu Black Afrikans were the first settlers of the Nile Valley in Egypt is also in agreement with modern science which claims that human beings first evolved out of Mount Ruwenzori area, about 180,000 to 200,000 years ago. Hominid remains have been found in East Africa's Rift Valley Olduvai Gorge region, which suggests the existence of a gradual evolution of hominids on the African plains, most notably, Australopithecus, followed by Homo erectus about 1.9 million years ago, and then to modern man, Homo sapien who emerged approximately 40,000 years ago. The Anu people who first settled the Nile Valley in Egypt is believed to have belonged to a group of these hominids that left the mountains to live on the open plains to create the Nubian Kushite Nakata culture, that would eventually result in the creation of Egypt's first dynasty under Narmer. The rock art of the Anu people who first settled the Nile Valley in the era of pre-dynastic Egypt depicted rock paintings in the Tassili Mountains of the Algerian Sahara which may be 7,000 or 8,000 years old, showing whole communities of African people who controlled the area of a life in the Green Sahara with hunting, animal scenes, and ox-drawn plows, also suggesting the planting and growing of crops. All this before the creation of Egypt's first dynasty. This settlement at Nabta Playa shows a developing pre-dynastic African Nubian society that had domesticated wild cattle known as the auroch. Evidence from the Nabta Playa rock calendar shows that the Anu Nubians of pre-dynastic Egypt had monitored the movements of the stars and the Nile River for at least 8,000 years. In addition, Nabta Playa is recognized as the world's oldest astronomical site, where the Anu Nubians who first settled the Nile Valley in Egypt in the pre-dynastic era, developed astronomy by devising a rock calendar monitoring the movement of the Sirius star, as a way of detecting changes in the Nile River's flood level for the purposes of ensuring adequate drinking water and pasture lands for their cattle. Egypt's Nile Valley region soon became the hub of an emerging Black African civilization with its own unique Black African Nubian proto-culture such which would later provide the template for the creation of the first dynasty of Egypt. It is also worth noting that, Ptah's son Ptaiki, the high priest dwarf, was the head chieftain of the Ajijis, whom was instrumental in the development of the Anu civilization. The extension of the Anu people is followed by the Anu Taya Wa Pygmies, who are also the Anu people. Based on the green-glazed Nubian carving dating to at least 3100 BCE, found at the temple at Abydos, depicts and describes them as a black Anu man, as a god of the earth of the Anu peoples of the god Set. Set was served by the priesthood of the Ba Taya Wa Pygmy Bes, who is amongst the oldest Egyptian gods, and it should be noted that the Egyptian word Anu means sky god from above, and that Nu, in Akkadian means Anu, from on, sky, heaven, or Anum, originally and Sumerian, was the divine personification of the sky, king of the gods, and ancestor of many of the deities in ancient Mesopotamian religion. With that being said, the hidden truth about the Anu and Anu Taya Wa Pygmy dwarves is that their high priest overseers were actually the Ajijis, the minor gods to the Anunnaki astronaut who were the major arcana. The Ajijis had left Mesopotamia due to endless painful labor, mining gold for their superior generals Enki and Enlil. They complained to Anu, and Anu blessed them with land and human kingship of their own, which happened to be the entire Nile River coastland, upper and lower. Most are probably not aware that the Mesopotamian god Anu is also the Egyptian god known as Ptah, and Ptaiki the high priest dwarf god is one of Ptah's half-sons, whom is the head of the human civilization and the entire Ajijis caliphate. Carved into the Narmer palette, the founding document of Egypt's first dynasty, where they are shown as priests leading the royal victory procession holding up the royal insignia. The Anu can further be considered the progenitors of the Nile Valley culture, which led first to the Kushites' Nubian Nakata culture, and then the establishment of Egypt by Narmer when he united Upper and Lower Egypt, after which the city of Memphis was built. According to the earliest Egyptian traditions, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Bes and Bastet, were also an Anu. It was the Anu who invented architecture, writing, irrigation and dry agriculture in the Nile Valley. The story of the Anu may therefore be the story of mankind's evolution in Africa, before and during the migration of the Grimaldi people, in part, all originated out of the Anu Taya Wa Pygmy civilization. You may be wondering at this point, why both the Anu, and the Anu Taya Wa Pygmy people, worshipped a god called Set. Well, in order to get a better understanding, I must briefly cover the bases about Set, and why he was highly acknowledged during this period. It all begins with the Anunnaki god, 40, which is Enki, whom I covered earlier. Well, he had a son named Amara Utu, also known as Marduk in Mesopotamia, the god of agriculture, water, magic, and creation. He was a minor god, that later rose up to an arcana god, 3,500 years later, and would reign above all gods thereafter. However, I will explain a much earlier time period, when he established and ruled over the land of Egypt, placing himself as Marduk, Ra, the pantheon god. After leaving Mesopotamia, Marduk Ra, along with his 3 sons, who were twins, Ashur, and Set, and his youngest son, Nabu, but in Egypt, Ashur is Orion, or Osiris, and Set is Seth, or Satu, and Nabu is Tahuti or Tahuti or Thoth, in Greek, or Hermes. In the Christian Bible, these twins are referred to as Cain and Abel, with Seth being referred to as the younger brother of the twins. However, Set was extremely jealous of his twin, Osiris. Osiris achieved divine light that brought him many followers, and the ability to bring forth agricultural elements based on the 3 seasons of Akhet, Peret, and Shamu. This brought on immense support and adoration from their father, Marduk. As a result, Seth became enraged and murdered his twin brother Osiris, in order to usurp the throne of ancient Kemet, known as Egypt. Osiris's wife Isis, or Aset, or Ishtar, later tries to avenge her husband Osiris's death by sending her son, Horus, to battle his uncle Seth. The story goes that Horus wins the battle, but, actually, it was Seth who won the battle, and that was the start of Seth's endless reign that carried on into today's world, filled of hate, racism, division, deception, power and mind control. Osiris represented the divine consciousness of awakening the Great Spirit, the process of which, mankind realizes his full God potential, through meditation of true self-actualization, as a divine being filled with love and aspirations for all things life. This was in accordance with the Kemetic divine 42 laws of Ma'at. And by that, the Egyptians understood the principal keys of achieving eternal life into the afterlife. The 42 laws of Ma'at would also later form the basis of the Torah's 10 commandments. One more thing I must shed some light on, before I move on, is that the hidden reality of how the new, post-dynastic world we live in today shaped the impact of our lives today. And of course, was signed and sealed long, long ago, by the inked signatures of bloodthirsty, power-mongering, medieval conglomerates, posing as the royal lineage to Seth. Seen on this historical document. Acknowledging that Seth is the legitimate son of the creator god of the human origin, and pantheon ancestor god of Adam and Eve. Which at this point we could confidently say, their claimed lineage is flawed. Need I say more? As the god, Set, governs over the Anu and Anu wa pygmies. Egypt, or Kemet, when developed, would be governed by the laws of Osiris. However, the Nubian Tossetti people at first were governed by the god, Horus. But when the kingdom of Kushites took over, they would be governed by Set. The kingdom of Tossetti civilization existed first before Kemet, which is Egypt. For this reason, the Nubian people of the kingdom of Tossetti are regarded as the founders of Kemet. As a result, Tossetti and Kemet are both considered to be the original names of ancient Egypt. Egypt is an English term. The original Kemetic name for this land was Hakupta, which means the land of black soil. Tossetti was known as the land of the bow, which was the main weapon of the Nubians of Tossetti, who established the first Egyptian Kemetic civilization. At the Kustul tombs, near the Sudanese border, show various symbols of Tossetti royalty, which also show that Tossetti is older than Kemet, or Egypt. These Nubian Kushite artifacts, such as an incense burner, a palace facade, and a king wearing the southern Nubian Kushite crown sitting on a throne in a boat bearing the royal standard of the falcon god Horus, suggest that of a unified Nubian monarchy was already established at Tossetti by 3800 BC. Evidence of the Tossetti kingship, in ancient Nubia from the Kustul tombs and Narmer palette, means Tossetti predates ancient Egypt. Based on the Narmer palette, and archaeological excavations, at sites like Kustul, there is evidence to conclude that Tossetti is the oldest Nile Valley civilization that existed before ancient Egypt, where a unified Nubian monarchy ruled from the southern province of Tossetti from at least 3800 BC. This earlier Tossetti Nubian Nile Valley culture existed into the late Naqada period of Egyptian history, and extended from the south downwards along the Nile as various new provinces or nomes were created until the unification of the south of Upper Egypt, and the north Lower Egypt by Narmer. As the oldest Nile Valley civilization, the Tossetti civilization should also be regarded as one of pre-colonial Africa's greatest contributions to world civilization. After the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt to form Kemet, the nome of Memphis was established as the first nome of Kemet to serve as a defensive colony to protect the interior from invasion. Kemet then extended its nomes provinces into the delta and all the way into the Mediterranean, under Pharaoh Thutmose III, in the period during when the Egyptian Kemetic civilization reached its greatest territorial extent. In this period Kemet adopted and developed the Egyptian Kemetic civilization culture, which had inherited such as the Osirian religion, and the hieroglyphic Medu Neter script, which had already been developed before the existence of dynastic Egypt as the model for civilization in Kemet. By 3800 BCE, Tossetti had risen to become the most powerful chieftaincy in the Nile Valley region during the unified late Naqada period of Egyptian history. The Pharaonic Egypt is arguably the most famous ancient civilization on the African continent. This does not mean, however, that it was the only ancient civilization that sprang from African soil. Egypt, and their southern neighbors, the Nubians, were both disputing over the trade of the Egyptian gold, due to the abundance of this precious metal in their lands, have had an uneasy relationship with the Egyptians over the course of a millennia. At times, the Tossetti Nubians were seen as allies of the Egyptians, while at other times they were seen as wretched enemies. Under the Kingdom of Kush, however, the Nubians would conquer Egypt and establish a dynasty of their own. Most notably, the conquering of Egypt, by the Kushites, marked the end of the Osiris religion and the beginning of the rule of Set, also known as Seth. Okay, we now have a clear understanding of the very first Homo sapien civilizations to walk the planet. Which were the Ubaids, the Anu people, the Taiwa Pygmies, the Tossetti Nubians, and later the Kemet Egyptians. So, let's take a look at how they helped populate the entire world we know today. Starting with the Ani Yunwea people, their closest ancestors, their descendants, and their evolution. The Ani Yunwea people. They are the people of the mountains, and will later become the Olmecs, the Cherokee Indians, and the Mexicans. The Olmecs were Moors from the Dogon tribe in Mali, Africa, who migrated over the Bering Strait as early as 100,000 years ago to America, which they called it, Utla, in their Kushite language. This migration included Pygmies, Negroes and black Australoids similar to the indigenous black people of Australia, parts of Asia and India. The Mayans were the descendants of these Malian Moors, referred to as Black Mexicans or Quetzalcoatl. The Malian Moors are descendants of the Nubian Egyptians. Their other descendants are the Tainos, Mendas, Ethiopians, Somalians, Cherokee Indians, Hopi Indians, Apache Indians, Aztec, Zuni, Nez Perce, Miami Blackfoot, Catawba, Seminole, Mexicans, Jamaicans, Haitians, Cubans, Dominicans, Barbadians, African Americans with DNA haplogroup L0L3 type, and Greeks. When the Dogons migrated to America, they also brought the rubber tree with them, which is native only to Africa. The Dogons utilized the sap from the rubber tree to make shoes and coats, being the first to introduce soles on shoes to the New World. The term Olmec means rubber people. Furthermore, in Mexico, a type of paper made from a particular kind of wood pulp was discovered, which scientists confirmed is only found in Egypt. Even the ceremonial dance of the Hopi Indians is identical to the Dogon's Bado dance of Africa, which have the same symbols and spirit names. These Olmecs migrated to North America from Mexico as the Washita, Yamasee and the Ben Ismael tribes, a collection of what is known as the Lenape, Wampanoag, and Nanticoke Indians, who later migrated to Indiana and Illinois, identifying themselves as Moors, but the United States government classified them as Negroes, in order to strip them of their indigenous rights. Let's take a moment to let that sink in. Also, the back of the Olmec head below shows an Ethiopian braided hair style with an African man next to it, wearing a similarly braided hair style. This provides a powerful statement in support of these heads being African in nature. Other recent discoveries in the area of linguistics have shown that the Afro-Olmecs of Mexico, also known as the She people, were West Africans of the Mende indigenous group. Decoded inscriptions discovered on these ancient Olmec monuments in Mexico show that the language used in the script by the ancient Olmecs is identical to the language used by the ancient and modern Mende-speaking West Africans. What's interesting is that California is referred to as the African state by those who know its history, since it was the first state used as a base by ancient Africans from China, Melanesia, East Africa and Nubia, Egypt during prehistoric times. One of the important migrations of black Africans to Mexico included people who were described as dwarfs called magicians, and were involved in religious shamanistic practices that are still common in West Africa today. The Ainu people. The Ainu originated in the Nile Valley and dispersed to northern Japan, northwestern China, and eastern Canada. The Ainus are descendants of the Anu Taiawa Pygmies. Among the Taiawa descendants are San, Bushmen, Booty Pygmies, Bantus, Igbos, Botswanians, Zimbabwe, South Africans, North Nigerians, Tanzanians, Kenyans, Yorubans, Sub-Saharans, Caucasians, African Americans with DNA haplogroup L0L6, Eurasians, Portuguese, Modern Asians, Japanese, Jomans, Germans, Romanians, Russians, and Europeans. The Ainu are the indigenous people of the land surrounding the Sea of Okhotsk, including Hokkaido Island, Northeast Honshu Island, Sakhalin Island, the Kuril Islands, the Kamchatka Peninsula and Khabarovsk Krai, all before the arrival of the first Yamato Japanese, and Russians. These regions are referred to as Izo in historical Japanese texts. The Ainu first began to leave Africa at about 60,000 BC. These Africans had two great migrations east. The first, OOA migration, saw blacks with straight hair, taking a route along the coast of Asia, and then, island hopping, across the Indian Ocean to Australia, the Australian Aborigine, and then making their way to South America, the remains called Luzia, in Brazil. The second OOA migration event saw blacks from Africa, some with straight hair and Mongol features. These were the Sand Bushman Africans that had taken an inland route through southern Asia and on up to China about 50 to 45,000 BC, where they settled. Included with this group were straight-haired blacks without Mongol features, now called Dravidians, who stayed close to Africa and settled in India and other areas of southern Asia. A recent international study undertaken by Shanghai scientists and multinational academics has confirmed that the Chinese did not originate from Peking Man in northern China as was once believed, but from the Black East Africans, similar to these who migrated via South Asia to China, about 100,000 years ago. Results of the analysis indicate that Southeast Asia was the first destination of the migration from Africa to Asia, which commenced about 100,000 years ago, moving into southern China before crossing the Yangtze River into northern China. The original black population that lived in China was the Negritos and Australoid groups. After 5000 BC, Africoid people from Kush in Africa began to enter China and Central Asia from Iran, while another group reached China by sea. This two-route migration of blacks to China led to the development of southern and northern Chinese branches of Africoids. The northern Chino-Africans were called Kui Shuang Kushana, or Yuchi, while the southern tribes were called Yi and Liman Yuan Man. The Inuit people will produce Australians, Canadians and Alaskans, 1,000 years later after the migration out of Africa. The Inuits are a group of culturally similar indigenous peoples inhabiting the Arctic and subarctic regions of Greenland, Labrador, Quebec, Nunavut, the Northwest Territories, and Alaska. The Inuits are descendants of the Kiowa Pygmies. Pygmies' other common descendants also includes the Ainus, San, Bushman people, Booty Pygmies, Bantus, Igbos, Botswanians, Zimbabwe, South Africans, Ethiopians, Mongolians, Kojans, Aborigines, Indonesians, Asians, Koreans, Nunavut, Eurasians, Indo-Europeans, Australians, Alaskans, South Americans, Irelands, Canadians, African Americans with DNA haplogroup L0, L2, MN, N, P, and R-type. The Inuits were the OOA, the first, out of the two groups to migrate out of Africa. I mentioned this previously on the Ainu's migration of blacks with straight hair, taking a route along the coast of Asia, and then, island hopping, across the Indian Ocean to Australia, the Australian Aborigine, and then making their way to South America. As we know, the first early humans emerged from Africa nearly 2 million years ago whom were dark, about 1.2 million years ago to less than 100,000 years ago, archaic humans, including archaic Homo sapiens, whom were also dark-skinned. They slowly evolved into the Inuit, then, Asians, native Australians and eventually Canadian Caucasoid admixtures. There was no evidence of deep continuity from ancient humans like Homo erectus to modern humans outside Africa. The features of today's Chinese and native Australians are less than 50,000 years old, rather than more than 1 million as first claimed in the 1800s by multi-regionalist. A black native of India, carrying the skin pigmentation gene logged as SLC24A5, passed it to the people of Ireland through his ancestors. Further research suggests that this hereditary makeup of pale skin genes began to be genetically controlled around 8,000 years ago. Blonde Eskimos is a term first applied in accounts of sightings of, and encounters with, light-haired Inuit then known as Eskimo, peoples of northern Canada from the early 20th century, particularly around the Coronation Gulf between mainland Canada and Victoria Island. It was once interpreted that Africa lagged far behind Europe and Asia in the development of modern humans and their complex behavior. In fact, thanks to new excavations and studies, that was far from the truth. They discovered that the Jebel or Hout fossil is actually about 300,000 years old and thus a very plausible ancestral form for Homo sapiens. They found the darkest skin in the Nilo-Saharan pastoralist populations of eastern Africa, such as the Mursi and Surma, and the lightest skin in the San of southern Africa, as well as many shades in between, as in the Agau people of Ethiopia. Understanding melanin in the body. Chemically, melanin is composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen and nitrogen. The word melanin being taken from the Greek word melos for black, or dark, which refers to the group of natural amino acid pigment cells found in most living things. These melanin cells belong to a special group of pigment cells called melanocytes. The three basic types of melanin are eumelanin, pheomelanin, and neuromelanin. Eumelanin and pheomelanin are the determinants of skin color or pigmentation. Eumelanin or dark melanin contains a higher concentration of dark carbon atoms than pheomelanin. The source of melanin is carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen that make up melanin. Like other elements on Earth, came from exploded stars dating all the way to the Big Bang or beginning of time. Melanin is composed primarily of carbon, which is the building block of most matter and life in the universe. For this reason, the carbon in melanin enhances the body's physical, spiritual and mental processes in the same way chlorophyll enhances biomechanical processes in plants. Now, understanding albinism. It's a mutated genome the Kosian Mongols carried, which was a OCA type 1 gene, that causes albinism. Oculocutaneous albinism is a form of albinism involving the eyes ocula, plus skin cutaneous, and according to some definitions, the hair as well. 4 types of oculocutaneous albinism have been described, all caused by a disruption of melanin synthesis, the substance in the skin which makes it dark, and which protects the body from the sun, and all are autosomal recessive disorders defect. One of the sad and unfortunate facts is that many anthropologists, researchers and academics still refuse to acknowledge that Africans were the first human colonizers of Europe. To hide this fact, one can only assume it's intentional. Here's a look at how the transference of the genome of OCA type 1 and SLC24A5 gene play a role in developing the coxoid admixtures to modern Europeans. The final geographical group that populated the world are the Anu people. These group of people are amongst one of the oldest preserved DNA lines, with the most basal ancestral Y chromosome gene and mtDNA X haplogroup to the so-called Adam and Eve bloodline. The Anu people, after developing Kush, Kemet, which is Egypt, and of course the Tossetti Nubian Empire along the Nile Valley. Hundreds of years have passed. They began infighting amongst each other over power and whose god was mightier, victorious and prosperous than the other. They also began intermixing with the populace, which resulted in the destruction of Egypt, causing it to become a decadent and degenerate society, as a consequence of this heavy saturation of divine blood. Intermixing was absolutely forbidden under their original kinetic laws of the Innu, to the merit. The high priest dwarf gods Bast and Pataiki, son of Ptah, of the Ajiji Anu people Kemetic culture, that had been developed specifically for their divine kingships and beyond the cosmic development. So, with that being said, by this time, Enki, whom had ruled Eridu for over 3,500 years, left Earth due to the dramatic uprising of power and chaos. Meanwhile, Marduk Ra remained and had replaced Enlil's position at the head of the Mesopotamian pantheon amongst all gods. His youngest son Nabu, or Thoth, in exile had fled to Atlantis, while Seth was determined to seek complete worship over both Upper and Lower Egypt and its surrounding territories. Because of the way Osiris died, the Anu people looked at Seth as the opposite of good, and had no longer worshipped his heir, the divineness. The Tossetti Nubians, on the other hand, worshipped Seth with full force of annihilation to anyone who disagreed, which ultimately led to the events linked to Babylon's emergence as the region's dominant power in the 18th century BC. When the 19th dynasty pharaoh, Seti I, came into power. The name, Seti, means, of Set, which indicates that he was consecrated to the god Set, also termed, Sutek, or, Seth, who ruled for 55 years under the unethical laws of Seth, whose energy that carried on in the minds of people for generations into the present day, with the only difference being the name, in which we praise, yet the same energy that never dies, just transforms. It can be light, and it can be dark. The only way to tell is if it's love, which truly represents all, without the weighing of an ounce of separation to the human kingdom, the animal kingdom, the vegetable kingdom, and the mineral kingdom, which is all connected to our divine source. Now, according to the Shabaka stone relic, which dates back between circa 2649 to 2150 BCE. Explains the Memphite creation theology version of the Egyptian creation story, which states, Ptah is pure consciousness as the principal emanation of the unseen supreme being. It goes on to say that from the remaining primordial Nun, the following pairs of principles that govern the natural world emerged as part of Atum. 1. Nun, and Nonit, the above, and below. 2. Ha, and Hau-Het, infinite, and finite. 3. Kuk, and Ka-Uket, darkness and light, and 4. Amun, or, Amun and, Amaunet, the seen, and the unseen. There is 8 principles that govern the natural order. These 8 deities are created when Atum divides itself into other deities made up of a total of 4 pairs. 1. Shu, is air. 2. Tefnut, is moisture. 3. Jeb, is earth, and 4. Nut, is sky, who are said to have given birth to 4 other gods. 5. Osiris, the god of omnipotence, and omniscience. 6. Isis, wife of Osiris, female principle. 7. Seth, the opposite of good. 8. Nephthys, female principle in the unseen world. And 9, if you count Nabu, whom is not listed on the Shabaka stone as the intellectual wisdom of consciousness. When it comes down to Anu, Egyptian religion and science, the royalty had their own way of keeping the bloodline 100% pure. But this happened in a different way, you would think. They basically ended up with this simple model. Matriarchal. The divine ruler's mother must be from the great house Upper Egyptian bloodline. The father, however, could be from anywhere. The womb that created the king is the only thing that mattered. This in return is called the Holy Grail, which is the holy womb amongst this matriarchal family tree. The Christian Bible may call it Genesis, and add false unverifiable characters, but the rules of etymology calls it for what it truly is. Genesis, root word, the generation of Isis. Israel root name, Israel is, Ra, and El, Sumerian name for Enki. From Nut and Jeb, to the deities, Osiris, Isis, Seth, Nephthys and Nabu were born, and from generations after that, their energy and bloodline lives on through their most basal descendants, starting with the first man, and the first woman, the so-called Adam and Eve. I will list, not mine thoughts but official scientific DNA data, that will prove who the rightful patrilineal and matriarchal lineages of God and mankind alike. Starting with Eve, mitochondrial matriarchal human lineage L-type. Haplogroup L0 arose between about 200 and 130 Kya, near about the same time as L1, before the beginning of the Eemian. It is associated with the peopling of southern Africa, after about 140,000 years ago. Its subclades are L0D and L0K. Both are almost exclusively restricted to the Khoisan of southern Africa, but L0D has also been detected among the Sanda people of Tanzania, which suggests an ancient connection between the Khoisan and East African speakers of Click languages. Haplogroup L0F is present in relatively small frequencies in Tanzania among the Sanda people who are known to be older than the Khoisan. L0A is most prevalent in Southeast African populations, 25% in Mozambique, and L0B is found in Ethiopia. Haplogroup L1 diverged from L at about 140,000 years ago. Its emergence is associated with the early peopling of Africa by anatomically modern humans during the Eemian, and it is now mostly found in Bantu and semi-Bantu speaking West African populations. Haplogroup L5 was formerly classified as L1E, but is now recognized as having diverged from L1 at about 120 Kya. It is also mostly associated with pygmies, with highest frequency in Booty pygmies, from eastern Central Africa at 15%. Haplogroup L2 diverged from L1, 4, and 6 L2 at about 90 Kya, associated with the peopling of East-West Africa. As a result of the Southeast Bantu migration, it is now spread throughout central sub-Saharan Africa, at the expense of the previously more widespread L0, L1 and L5. Haplogroup L6 diverged from L3, L4 and L6 at about the same time, 90 Kya. It is now a minor haplogroup with distribution mostly limited to the Horn of Africa and southern East Africa. Haplogroup L3 diverged from L3 and L4 at about 70 Kya, likely shortly before the southern dispersal event out of Africa migration, possibly in East Africa. The mtDNA of all non-Africans is derived from L3, divided into 2 main lineages, M and N. Haplogroup L4 is a minor haplogroup of East Africa that arose around 70 Kya but did not participate in the out of Africa migration. The haplogroup formerly named L7 has been reclassified as a subclade of L4, named L4A. Now, let's look at the so-called Adam patrilineal Y chromosome lineage. There are two most distinct basal Y chromosome lineages, which were haplogroup A and haplogroup BT. Haplogroup A is found at low frequencies in parts of Africa, but is common among certain hunter-gatherer groups. Haplogroup BT lineages represent the majority of African Y chromosome lineages and virtually all non-African lineages. Y chromosomal Adam was represented as the root of these two lineages. Haplogroup A and haplogroup BT represented the lineages of Y chromosomal Adam himself and of one of his sons, who had a new SNP. The two most basal lineages of haplogroup A, A0 and A1 prior to the announcement of the discovery of haplogroup A00 in 2013, have been detected in West Africa, Northwest Africa and Central Africa. Cruciani, 2011, suggests that these lineages may have emerged somewhere in between Central and Northwest Africa. Scazzari, 2012, also supported the hypothesis of an origin in the northwestern quadrant of the African continent for the A1b and A0 haplogroup. By the definition of haplogroup A, as non-BT, it is almost completely restricted to Africa, though a very small handful of bearers have been reported in Europe and Western Asia. Haplogroup A's oldest subclades are exclusively found in central northwest Africa, where the patrilinear ancestor of modern humans is believed to have originated. The clade has also been observed at notable frequencies in certain populations in Ethiopia, as well as some pygmy groups in Central Africa, and less commonly Niger-Congo speakers, who largely belong to the E1b1a clade. Haplogroup E, in general, is believed to have originated in Northeast Africa, and was later introduced to West Africa from where it spread around 5,000 years ago to Central, Southern, and Southeastern Africa, with the Bantu expansion. In a composite sample of 3,551 African men, haplogroup A had a frequency of 5.4%. The highest frequencies of haplogroup A have been reported among the Khoisan of southern Africa, Beta Israel Ethiopians, and Nilo-Saharans from Sudan. In North Africa, haplogroup is largely absent. Its subclade A1 has been observed at trace frequencies among Moroccans. Recent population movements from West Africa changed the pre-existing population Y chromosomal diversity in Central, Southern and Southeastern Africa, replacing the previous haplogroups in these areas with the now dominant E1b1a lineages. Traces of ancestral inhabitants can be observed today in these regions.
That there will come a time when black people wake up and become intellectually independent enough to think for themselves, as other humans are intellectually independent enough to think for themselves. Then the black man will think like a black man, and he will feel for other black people. And this new thinking and feeling will cause black people to stick together. And then at that point, you'll have a situation where when you attack one black man, you are attacking all black men. And this type of black thinking will cause all black people to stick together. And this type of thinking also will bring an end to the brutality inflicted upon black people by white people. And it is the only thing that will bring an end to it. No federal court, state court, or city court will bring an end to it. It's something that the black man has to bring an end to himself.